No,
the responsible
exactly,
thing would be for the GSMA to cancel the show.
You think? Are you catching that, GSMA?
Probably, because if it does, if there's all this, what companies are obviously really worried about it, and they want to, they feel it should go and have some kind of presence, even if it's reduced. But
hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. Jamie's off going to Wales to watch the rugby and doubtless get himself into all sorts of hijinks. So we've got Iain in and super sub Wei. All right, Wei, how's it going?
Yeah.
So this is, I promise, a coincidence, what with Wei being Chinese, but we're going to talk about coronavirus because it's got relevance to the telecoms industry for a variety of reasons, but uppermost is probably impending Mobile World Congress and what effect is it going to have on that. Then I think we will talk a little bit, which again has a Chinese element, again a complete coincidence, where he's going to be like, look, you're taking a piss now, Scott.
Yeah. Got used to it.
Yeah, well, there is that. I've desensitized you over these years. We can talk about Americans decided, I know what, we'll just make our own telecoms industry and then we won't have to be reliant on shifty foreigners. And we'll talk about the likelihood of them pulling that off. And then we're going to finish off talking a little bit about Vodafone, who had their quarterlies, and they've got a few other interesting things going on at the moment. So yeah, coronavirus. Wei, you're Chinese. What's going on?
Sorry, this bit is scripted. Yeah.
That was a scripted cough.
Yeah, exactly.
I get it.
Yeah.
Actually, do you know what? Joking aside, like on Twitter and stuff, I've got people going that, like, when a Chinese person sits next to them on the tube.
Yeah, I saw that this morning.
Yeah,
because on a very crowded tube train, and everyone was rather stand.
No one knows what to do. That's the thing.
Then sitting next to a Chinese girl, something like that.
Really,
hasn't happened to me yet.
No,
but yeah,
you got to work on that cough.
Did you
really put your back into
probably
it?
Because I'm not really wearing a mask. If I am, well, you never know.
Well, do you know, that's an ironic thing, because I expect to see a lot of those face masks at Mobile World Congress. I mean, they have been for a while, ever since, I think, like SARS years ago. It's not uncommon to see what I presume are Chinese people, or certainly people from that part of the world.
Yeah, in Eastern Asian, I think it's quite common for people to wear masks, especially in places like Japan.
Okay.
And if you know it, the point is not really to protect yourself from being contaminated. It's rather, in a way, it's almost altruistic,
right?
Because you're wearing it, so you will not spread the virus.
That's interesting. I never thought of that.
If you were actually carrying virus,
because the vibe it gives over is of a sort of horror. I'm going to protect myself from the horrid, filthy, unclean world.
I think we should all go around in those biological outfits in Mobile World Congress.
So
they look really cool.
Are you saying that the hot thing at Mobile World Congress will be wearables?
We did that last week, didn't we?
Yeah. Connected.
Stop labouring that joke.
Connected masks.
It was a Pierre one joke.
Well, I think on one hand, you have to be worried about it.
Yeah. Are you worried? You're going to Mobile World Congress?
No, I'll come to that.
Okay,
yeah, I'll come to that later. The short answer is no.
Right.
But I think we discussed that before the show came on, is the mortality rate is actually pretty high. So 2% is lower than SARS, is much lower than, well, earlier flus. We knew that, 100 years ago. But it's much higher than flu, because people nowadays, you see often people comparing
today.
Comparing the number of people died out of the coronavirus versus died of common flu. Well, that's actually a wrong comparison. The absolute number of people died out of common flu is higher, but the mortality rate is much lower. It's just 0.1% mortality rate, to compare with 2% for a coronavirus.
But it is still, to some extent, and I haven't looked into the microbiology of it, but it's a respiratory tract illness that is conveyed, that's passed on in the standard respiratory tract way, like sort of droplets in the air.
Yes,
I think if you die of pneumonia.
It's easy to catch.
Yeah, then you catch it, then you sort of
so it really
it develops into pneumonia. Yeah. So on one hand, yes, but on the other hand, I mean, there are plenty of measures being taken by both the Chinese government and other countries in the world. I mean, you just think about it, the province which is the epicenter of the whole thing. There are 60 million people being locked down, so that's the same size as the UK.
I know.
So
I listened to a podcast that said that Shanghai, which is one of the biggest cities in the entire world, is just dead.
Well,
people aren't even driving around and stuff.
Especially if you compare.
By the way, I mean dead metaphorically.
Yeah. Better being
not
metaphorically.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
And now it's because it's just the Chinese New Year period, and normally it will be the busiest period of the year.
It's kind of screwed up the year.
Yeah, the streets are so quiet, and
didn't they extend the Chinese New Year holiday to?
A few provinces do extend the break. Yeah, I think a few provinces they will only resume activities on the 10th of February.
Right.
So that will be that
like 10
will
more
be a
days.
very, I think 1 week longer.
That
will be much longer than normal. So that will have inevitably a lot of impact on retail in particular, on entertainment industries and stuff like that. So that comes to manufacturing apparently. So that comes to its impact on telecom. So that the province where the thing started, it has quite a few big manufacturers,
right?
Including, I just read this morning, the world's biggest copper wire manufacturer.
Okay.
So that will have some direct impact on telecom, and it will have some indirect. Well, I wouldn't say indirect, but it's a pretty direct actually. As we are going to Mobile World Congress, and there are some companies that probably will be more hesitant, either not to go at all or to reduce the people coming out of China.
Jamie wrote a story on this week that LG's completely pulled out.
Yeah.
And said he has come up with this thing where they go, we'll go, but the only people we'll let go are people who've sort of self-quarantined in China for 2 weeks and not dropped down dead.
Yeah.
And then gone over to Europe and self-quarantined for another 2 weeks and not dropped down dead.
Yeah.
And so you've got to have a full month.
So you had to have started doing this already then, basically.
You have to, wouldn't
So
it?
it's really
So
expensive.
they've announced this, but this would have had to have been implemented a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Their senior staff will.
does sound
I believe
expensive,
their senior staff should already be in Europe.
Yeah.
Because they are required to self-quarantine for 2 weeks in Europe. Then the staff coming out of China will be. I think they say to make sure that they don't have any symptoms the 2 weeks previous to the trip to Barcelona. Then their stand staff will mainly be the staff members from
Europe.
Their employees outside of China.
Or just pure outsourced Spanish people or whatever.
Yeah.
I just don't believe that they saw the first glimpse of it and they were like, oh my God, let's...
Yeah, I don't either.
Like the next day they were like, you know what, this is going to become
And
huge.
I don't believe it's
Let's
enforceable
move right
anyway.
away. Yeah, how can you...
You can't enforce
really
someone
check?
self-isolating themselves. You can't monitor that. They can't monitor people self-isolating
No, they can't.
themselves.
Like I said, they not even ring for a pizza.
They can say, did you self-isolate yourself?
Yeah, but at the same time, people do. I mean, if you read from the Chinese media, people do worry about it, and they do lock themselves down in their own
I'm sure
house
people are going to take precautions because they're worried about it. But they're not going to shut themselves into solitary confinement for 2 weeks.
No.
Well, ZT seemed genuinely concerned that its own people were going to have a hard time because of it.
Yeah.
And they genuinely, it sounded like they didn't want to alarm.
No, exactly.
People at Mobile World Congress. So this is the weird thing. It's sort of double-edged because you've got everyone else going to Mobile World Congress. All four of us are going, aren't we? Mm-hmm. So I'll make sure my will's up to date before I go. I know, too much. Okay. And so there's some concern there. I'm personally inclined to be like, well, it's just a risk factor. There are risk factors all the time. You get on the plane, there's a risk factor.
Yeah.
So I don't feel too anxious about it. But then there's from the Chinese side, they don't want to be sort of held stigmatized or held culpable for spreading this turning it into a pandemic and all that sort of thing. So it's kind of weird. No one really knows how to act, and that's why I brought up those little anecdotal things of like public transport.
Yeah.
It's just people don't know how to act.
The responsible thing would be for the GSMA to cancel the show.
You think? So are you catching that, GS, mate?
Probably, because if it does, if there's all this, what companies are obviously really worried about it, and they want to, they feel they should go and have some kind of presence, even if it's reduced. But
you say the responsible thing to do. I don't know to what extent you're saying that to be just provocative for the hell of it, or because you just don't fancy going.
Well,
you get to this thing, and actually, it's analogous to the sort of US. UK Huawei stuff that we've discussed in the last few weeks, something called, I think, the precautionary principle, whereby, if there's some people saying, people who criticise the UK's decision to allow Huawei into the network to some extent, they were going, these tended to be just regular pundits, not telecoms experts, tend to go, well, if there's any risk at all, why take it? But if you could extend that to all forms of different forms of risk.
And
so there has to be a threshold.
Yeah, there has to be a threshold. I mean, to say that no one should do any international travel, no one should leave their houses, people should self-isolate themselves, all that stuff is ridiculous. That's not going to happen. Things have to... someone getting on a plane and flying to a business trip somewhere in the world is like a manageable risk. But you're talking about one of the world's biggest trade shows, which involves huge numbers of people coming in from all over the world and a huge number from China, and at a time when this is on the up.
250
it just
plus
seems
exhibitors.
this is on the, if you look at the scale of manageable risks, to me this is kind of fairly high up there.
I see.
This is the sort
Fair
of thing that's going to this could easily spread this infection into Catalonia, and then from there it becomes really bad. And then what will everyone say? They'll go, well, they should have done the sensible thing and cancel the show. Actually, the Spanish authority should do what the US has done and actually stop people. I mean, what will happen then, of course, if they impose travel restrictions, is everybody will just fly to Frankfurt.
So the US, just to recap there, the US basically said all direct flights from
anybody
China
who's visited China in the last few weeks cannot come into the
they
US.
already fly mostly
with the exception
Frankfurt.
of American citizens.
Yeah.
So any other...
Right.
Which was
people from
criticised
any other
by
countries,
China for sort of inciting fear and panic.
And that's also yet another sort of almost impossible situation. So countries will say, right, we're not allowing any Chinese people coming in from China, but we'll allow our lot.
Yeah.
Well, our lot might just be just as infected.
Well, it's originated in China, hasn't it?
I mean, our lot coming from China. So you got Dave, who teaches English as a foreign language.
They mostly go through Frankfurt anyway. So
yeah, well, that's the problem.
Frankfurt. So stay the away from Frankfurt.
That's the problem with the Spanish authorities doing something, is that it would just make people go through another route. So then it falls on the GSMA to actually do the responsible thing and say we're going to cancel it this year. But they don't want to do that because
of course not.
Most of their revenue comes from this show, so they'd have to lay off loads of people if they did that.
And I mean, you have to think also, like, it's not only Europeans that are going there. I mean, how many Americans do you think at World Congress? 10,000? 15,000?
Maybe more than that. I don't really know. Yeah.
It's generally overrun with them.
I mean, it's 109,000 last year, and they're expecting the same number.
No way.
Well, LG's pulled out, so that's a what?
500
couple of thousand, 500.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
so
it's already down from that.
The number from China will be much smaller.
And the other thing you've got to think is
year.
the number of attendees. If you look at I put a graph together at attendee numbers since 2006. It goes like that, and the last 3 years it goes like that. It's basically just plateaued. Just plateaued.
For those listening on audio,
but even the basic, attendee is like, I'm just going to go, pay a free or get a whatever pass and have a walk around World Congress. They won't do that. Like, I don't want to meddle with all these people.
So you think just the general sort of pen collecting foot traffic will be down? Because
you're talking about exhibitors not going, but what about people going just to check out
these
the show?
statements that ZTE and the GSMA as well are putting out about we're people are going to self-isolate. There's going to be additional hygiene facilities. We're going to clean the stands. We're going to do this.
Don't encourage people to shake hands.
I just don't. I think all of that's.
But it's
when you talk about inciting fear, that's just going to make people more scared. That will actually make more people stay away. Because people think if it's such a worry that we can't even shake hands when we go over there, and we have to be. We have to be cleaning ourselves all the time.
We've got to go around looking like
people will just go. This is not what
you cannot talk to each other. Further. You'd have to stand 10 feet apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Minimum 10 feet apart.
And sort of avert. Sort of look to the side while you're talking. Yeah, it's going to be weird, man.
Yeah,
it's going to be weird. It'll be interesting to see the proportion of people wearing face masks.
I mean, what's the chances of this thing? It's 2 weeks away now. The show, 3 weeks. I mean, it's not going to resolve in that period of time, is it? And it's not going to come under control. Probably, it's just going to be a bit worse than it is now. I suspect. So, possibly a lot worse than it is now.
Apparently. But I was going to say, Mobile World Congress aside, it will have some big but short-term impact on other parts of the telecom industry.
Yeah.
Smartphone sales, for example, in China, it will go down.
Well, Nokia today said there's
By how
an
much?
impact on its supply chains.
Why don't most
Yeah,
people
there
order
must
online
be.
anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I thought people mostly order their phone online anyway.
Can you trust the courier?
Yeah, well,
It's-
there
but
are
the phone is
courier
sealed.
services. There are still courier services, but
Why do you think the smartphone industry would be affected? Are you talking about people going into shops?
Yeah, people don't go to shops anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, in retail in general. But on the other hand, the reason I'm saying it will be short-lived is there will be a pent-up demand.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I lived through, 17 years ago, during the SARS period. And there was a big drop.
Were you in China then?
I was in China at that time. And then after summer, and the market just bounced back.
Yeah.
And the seasonality was completely distorted because of the pent-up demand.
Yeah.
So there will be impact short-term, but the impact anyway.
What, Ian? You just mentioned Nokia. So you listened in on their analyst call. They just we might as well make a nod to it. They had their quarterlies that were sort of all right. They were better than the last lot, that's for sure.
It's kind of getting things under control on the 5G
but they
problems
didn't
they've had.
set the world on fire. But at least it wasn't a continued slide.
No, it was a bit downbeat in terms of the outlook, but not.
Yeah, they were
not
cautious,
outlook
weren't they?
Well,
And
it wasn't
they're
even
basically
out
saying-
for Nokia; it was out for the addressable market. I remember a couple of years ago they were saying 2020 is going to be when everybody's spending, huge
What did they
amounts of
say
money.
about the addressable market?
Totally flat this year.
That's funny because Deloro has said 4%
Yeah.
increase.
Well, this is Nokia's addressable market. You got to remember is not just RAN.
Right.
But
okay.
the bits that are really growing in Nokia's addressable market are the non-RAN bits anyway. The bits that are doing really well.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
maybe
they're
not
famously
massively
having a bit of a
outgrowing
mare
the
on
market
the RAN
growth,
side.
perhaps, but.
Yeah.
But they're saying flat, and they've highlighted loads of risk factors this year, of which coronavirus is one.
Right.
US merger uncertainty in the US, which was also
Yeah.
flagged by Ericsson.
Ericsson, that was their
and
big
this whole
excuse.
India thing, because the operators there,
Yeah.
where there's this regulatory push to get
Yeah.
money off the operators because they apparently owe loads of money to the government.
Yeah. Well, hold that because we'll bring that up when we talk about Vodafone.
And therefore, the operators are going to. The Nokia is sort of basically implying that will cut demand.
so there's basically all sorts
So
of adversarial
there's all sorts
stuff
of
going on.
adversarial
And
things
then there's
going
the
on.
generic sort of stiff competition that for some reason I don't know why public companies bother to talk
Yeah.
about competitive headwinds and. Like that.
Well, I just think
it's just table stakes.
I
Of
think there's
course-
been too much optimism
I think
about 5G anyway.
Right,
spending
well,
on
yes.
it. I mean, we've been going on
I
about
just
this
think
for a while. but-
for Nokia and Ericsson, there is some. I forgot the Ericsson numbers, but I was reading the Nokia numbers this morning. The weakest market is in China, in Greater China. They're
Yeah.
down by 25%. I mean, it just happened. I don't know whether it's coincidence or is just by design. Is in the middle of the trade war.
Yeah.
So
Well,
there's always been a ceiling for how many.
They hinted at it's interesting
Yeah.
because they hinted at profitability challenges in China, and they've been warning about China for a while now
Yeah.
that things might not work out as well there as they'd like with the sort of transition to 5G. And there was a suggestion today they've lost a bit of market share in China.
Yeah, that has
because Ericsson's
always
being
been-
extremely aggressive. I mean, most of the work obviously
Yeah.
goes to Chinese companies,
Yes,
and then Ericsson
exactly.
is trying to position itself as if you do use another vendor, then
Yeah.
then use us because we're really cost competitive now and we have a more profitable. I mean, their products are kind of don't have the sort of cost issues that Nokia's got,
That's right.
so they can be a bit more aggressive on pricing. So
Yeah.
I think they've lost a bit of their footprint there. But this is way off track now, isn't it? It's a massive segue.
Why are you making gestures at
Yeah,
me?
can we
Pierre?
take a quick break? 1 second, sorry.
So what they were saying about the supply chain issue on the call was that it could cause some disruption, and they haven't really figured out how bad things could be at the moment. They made this big case that they have a global supply chain now. They've kind of got investments in factories in other parts of the world, but they got asked a couple of times, not by me, but by another journalist,
By a proper journalist.
a proper one, whether their sort of facilities in China are operational, and they didn't really answer the question. So,
Yeah, and everyone.
so people are going to think they're not, obviously.
Well, and this, this is a good point. This is a point that's relevant about coronavirus, and also the geopolitical stuff that we talk about. Is most of the world's manufacturing happens in China.
Yeah.
You can't just cut off a country. I mean, you probably couldn't cut off any country, but certainly not China, the most populous, one of the biggest, and one of the most commercially interlinked countries in the whole world.
Yeah. There have been plenty of comments that, people trying to draw lessons out of the coronavirus crisis, that to highlight the importance of having a diversified supply chain and the whole setup. But it's just so difficult. It took China 20 to 30 years to get where it is. And you can't simply just replicate another or another few sort of similar sourcing markets like that in 1 or 2 years. It's just so difficult.
You give me a good segue there, the sort of diversification, because the US looks like it wants to go in the other direction. It wants to undiversify. Obviously, Trump's very protectionist, or at least he uses protectionist tactics to drive his famous hard bargains. And, I think we all agree that to what extent Huawei is a security threat has been, at the very least, exploited to the maximum possible amount by the Americans in order to, I think, generate another bargaining chip at the great geopolitical table. And one of their latest initiatives that both Telecoms.com and Light Reading wrote about this week, some bloke in the US government, some advisor, spoke to the Wall Street Journal and said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get big US tech companies. Sorry, I had a bit of chocolate and it went down the wrong way.
That's why we had to cut.
That's why we had to cut, so that Iain could give me the Heimlich manoeuvre, or so he claims. And they went, I'll tell you what, we'll get some US tech companies like Microsoft and Dell, who are big on servers and cloud, and we'll chuck them some money and get them to raise their game on this sort of new virtualized, the virtualization software that we've been talking about for years in telecoms. And they think that I don't think they explicitly said it in the story, but the strong implication was that when you combine it with ORAN, I think they did talk about sort of commoditized radio hardware. So they're effectively talking about ORAN. If we can do that, then we don't need to worry about vendors at all.
The problem with because it comes a few weeks after there was this proposal by a bunch of US senators as well to set up a fund, an ORAN fund, worth about $1 billion. And the idea would be that they support kind of US software companies, I think, and ORAN companies. So people like the likes of Altiostar, Mavenir, Parallel Wireless, which are all kind of working on these more open interfaces and the software that would run over the radio hardware. But the thing I find one of the things I find interesting about all of this sort of look, this viewing ORAN as a way to kind of boost US competition and to get them sort of back into the market is that ORAN doesn't exclude the Chinese or other parts of the world.
And if anything, it would presumably make it a bit harder to...
So Mavenir put a presentation together to the FCC, which Mike Dano at Light Reading originally reported on, and then I went and had a look at it.
As well.
And some of the points that Mavenir raised were that they've got the software companies, but they don't have any radio hardware guys in the US. They said they've got the design skills, but all those sort of white box radios that get made at the moment and the things that are likely to scale up, they all come from Taiwan and China and South Korea. Those are the big markets.
As with so much tech hardware.
And there's a reason for that, which is economies of scale and cheap
cost of labour and all that.
So with a $1 billion fund that seems largely aimed at software anyway, I don't see that getting on top of this issue. It's this sort of bonkers Trump idea that he can sort of return jobs to the US and that we can. And he's been on Apple about this in the past, hasn't he? That you need to start making your components in the US rather than in China.
Yeah, they've made a
bring
few
jobs
concessions
back.
just to
shut
shut
him up. They've made a few
up.
concessions, but it seems to be a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of how the global economy works these days, and it's like they want to return it to some kind of protectionist system where everybody does their own thing.
It is and it isn't a misunderstanding. If you look at it from a political point of view, he's saying, well, why should the global economy work that way?
Yeah.
But he is looking to turn back the clock and basically unglobalize
to a sort of
economy.
Saxon era.
Yeah, exactly. Where you've just got
Kingdom of Mercia,
where you've just got sturdy yeomen sitting over anvils. like something out of Asterix.
Yeah.
Well, quite Trump. I think the genie's out of the bottle on that one, son. But there you go. And incidentally, it should be noted while we're talking about Trump, he's had a really good week. He's got let off the impeachment.
Yeah.
He's had the Democrats just having hissy fits all over the place. I can't see any way he's not around for another 4 years.
No, it's
But anyway, that's another
Yeah.
matter. Sorry, what were you going to say, Wayne?
No, I was going to say, I mean, what you called earlier, the Balkanisation of the market, that's not new. I mean, that happened in 2G, 3G, 4G all the time.
In what way? You mean different technologies?
Different technologies, different standards.
Yeah.
Like you had all those acronyms like WCDMA and all that
Yes,
sort of
exactly.
Yeah.
The difference is, I mean, in the past, up to 3G or the early 4G period, it was typically the Chinese who would say, no, we want to go on our own way, and we want to own the intellectual property.
Yeah.
So we develop our own standards.
And they went with TD instead of FD. Was
exactly.
A big thing, wasn't it?
That was a 3G, and then it was a
That went
complete
nowhere.
failure.
Yeah.
Then
That was Betamax.
So that's why. Yeah, exactly. Well, Betamax was good.
Okay, it was TD not good.
That's one reason why the Chinese was very active in launching 4G, because they wanted to get rid of the legacy of 3G, so they could finally come to converge with the global standards, and then 5G is almost there. We're almost sort of converged into one standard.
Yeah.
Then suddenly
we haven't even got LTE versus WiMAX this time, have we?
No,
exactly. That was the battle, I think, in 4G.
That was 4G.
WiMAX was Betamax. I mean, they even put Max on the end. There should have been alarms when there was Max on the end. They should have gone, hold on. This is history repeating itself.
That's right. Was it Sprint who went?
Yeah,
for
they did.
WiMAX?
Well, they bought
Nextel.
chocolate. in my mouth.
Nextel. Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
Make sure it doesn't go the wrong way. That's not.
There's
pleasant.
another company called Clearwire, I think they bought, didn't
That's
they?
it. Yeah, I
see.
remember that.
Which is a WiMAX operator,
Okay.
and had loads.
Yeah.
So most of Sprint Spectrum, I think, all this stuff it's got at 2.5 gigahertz is
Yeah.
from that takeover.
Yeah.
And that was yet another failed
And
Intel
then they were
foray into
for
telecoms.
years on about WiMAX being the proper 4G standard, and they were going to use this all throughout the States. And
Yeah.
look what happened.
So the difference is this time is the Americans who started talking about going their own way.
Right.
So I mean that's something that's probably you don't have a clearer sign of the tide is changing. And
No, and I'll tell you another thing that just saddens me when politicians start trying to pick winners. So we've got all these US companies, we've got the aforementioned IT companies, and then we've got massive networking companies like Cisco and Juniper. All of those companies have, to some extent, over the last couple of decades, had a look at taking on the big kit vendors, I'm sure. I mean, Ian, you've got more experience of this than I, but I'm sure, Cisco's had a sort of service provider bit. Mm-hmm. But, they will have had boffins looking at the RAN side of it, seeing if there's something they can do that's competitive on the radio side of it. And they haven't, because they've presumably either tried and failed or done their exhaustive sort of market analysis and thought we just can't pull this off. And now these politicians are going, I'll tell you what, we'll chuck a few bucks at you, and then you sort it out. You raise your game.
Do you know what else is interesting about
that.
this, though? That the operators are constantly complaining about consolidation in the equipment market and the fact that there's only 3 big, powerful companies controlling kind of 80% of the market. But 2 of them, the Western ones, haven't been doing very well, have they? It's not as though you can look at their financials and say, well, they've been taking
Kicking
advantage of this three player position in the market, and they've got massive profit margins, and they've been doing really, really well, and they've been ripping everybody off, which is what you might expect if there was a market that was, that didn't have enough competition in it. That's generally what happens. It's quite the opposite. They're struggling. I mean, Ericsson was in 2016 looked like it could get broken up and sold off, and they've had to kind of rebuild, and Nokia's still got issues at the moment.
Its most recent quarterlies were a bit meh, weren't they?
Yeah.
They weren't all that.
So I just wonder where there's this kind of push to get more diversity into the market, but if you look at it from a kind of supply perspective, and like if you were to ask Ericsson and Nokia about this, and maybe we should sort of ask their senior management about it, what they think of this discussion, I'm pretty sure they'd go, well, look at our financial, look at our margins. We're on margins of sort of 4 or 5%. What are the operators reporting? 30% or something operating margins.
So it looks like they're getting better.
You know, who's
and yet it's the operators that are constantly on the ponce for state cash as well to invest.
And
I
can understand the operators' argument that they want more choice, that they want more sort of diversity because they don't want to be over reliant on a company that might run into problems down the road. But from a sort of financial perspective, this push to have lower costs and we're getting overcharged for equipment, it doesn't really add up if you look at the financials from those companies. I think it's a bit of a tenuous argument.
I agree. So I just can't see that coming off. Not that, you know, we've spoken about Iran before. I'm not gonna labour it, but yeah, obviously, ideally, you know, you look at the IT market, everything's quite commoditized. You know, you can buy a server from a bunch of different people, and within that server, the components will be from all over the place. There's no vendor lock-in. There's no monopolies or oligopolies. It's a totally open market right down to the last little transistor, to the best of my knowledge. And there's no doubt that would be an ideal situation. But I think we also know enough about telecoms to know that it's a lot. You know, people can assemble a PC from the parts in their front room.
Yeah,
I don't think you could assemble a sort of 5G base station just from some graphics cards and antennas that you bought off the internet. So it is more complicated. So that's a natural sort of barrier to entry. But as you say, if in spite of that high barrier to entry and that relatively little competition, the kit vendors aren't raking in the cash. I mean,
Huawei might have been doing until fairly recently, I suppose, but we're never really sure what's going on with Huawei because it's quite an opaque organisation.
But we also do reckon that it won a lot of its business in the last, let's say, decade from Chinese really aggressively undercutting the competition.
Yeah, how was it able to do that?
That was the argument that has been going on. I think it was 1 or 2 months ago. The Wall Street Journal ran a story about how over the years billions have been paid to Huawei from the Chinese government as subsidies, they could compete, they could undercut their European competitors. Then will these sort of new initiatives to sort of subsidize or support Western companies to compete be a counteract? Although this particular discussion is not, it's about the American sort of homegrown companies to compete and to develop their own products and expertise rather than subsidizing the Ericssons and the Nokias. But there was that argument. So how they managed to do that?
No, totally, and it's completely valid. And actually, that does beg another interesting argument about the current sort of geopolitical business state of play, which is so Western countries have got quite a lot of rules about state subsidies. Okay, within the European Union, they have some rules about state subsidy, although they got a bit of a nerve being all uptight about it because they're really protectionist towards anyone outside of the European Union. But generally, it's considered that under the World Trade Organization, it's not cool for countries to invest large amounts of public money to make their private companies more competitive than other countries' private, which is fair enough. Because if they allowed that, then you get this arms race of state subsidy. But when you got China, which I think does do that, I don't have proof, but it's generally accepted that China does do that.
Well, Huawei denied that.
Yeah, well, but whether it's with Huawei or whatever, you look at all these various sort of geopolitical initiatives they have, like Belt and Road. It's hard to believe that the state doesn't get involved in commerce quite actively. And so, but we still want to do business with China. We want their cash. We want them to buy our stuff. We want to import deflation from China because of their lower labour costs. So we get China to manufacture everything instead of making it in our own countries because it's actually cheaper that way for us. So we want all that globalised stuff, but we're also having to coexist with a country that has different rules when it comes to state intervention in the private sector. And that's something that's going to be really difficult to resolve because China will say all the right things. They'll go, no, we're good. Yeah, we might have done that in the past, but we're good now. We're totally on board. But everyone's like, are you though? You know, they're not that sure. And then at the same time, the flip side, and in some ways this is even more worrying, it legitimizes bad practice in the West. So you've got people like Donald Trump saying that I'm going to chuck money at this RAN initiative, or you got people like Boris Johnson sort of indicating that he might chuck money at broadband infrastructure, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we're tempted to get into this. If you can't beat them, join them.
I agree with Way on that, though. I think the $1 billion. There's a difference between pumping billions and billions into one company that is privately owned and sort of giving it sort of an unfair position in the market, sort of subsidising it effectively, and providing funds for research and development, which happens all the time. And I don't think that's in.
I mean, some of that's just in the labelling, isn't it?
You'd have to have a look at the WTO rules, but I think there's a big difference between public sector contributions to research and development that could give rise to some software companies that eventually go on to compete.
But it could also be used as a cover. The Chinese could say, we're going to put 1 billion yuan. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
1 billion yuan. I don't even know if that's a lot of money. What's the exchange rate?
It's about £2.50.
Yeah, it's about 7 to 8 per. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway,
let's say 1 zillion yuan to cover myself into R&D. And look, it all ended up with Huawei.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Is sometimes just a matter of labelling and semantics, and everyone plays it. Everyone tries to be cute. Everyone says they abide by WTO, but they're all going to try and favour their domestic champions.
But it's not just there's a lot of hypocrisy here anyway, because this whole dispute about dumping and WTO rules.
Okay.
It's not just there's this whole dispute that's been going on for years between Boeing and Airbus, isn't there? Which is all about flouting WTO rules.
Yeah, everyone takes the piss.
There's often sort of arguments in Europe about subsidies for farmers and things like that. So it's not.
It happens all the time.
So China gets sort of identified as a big villain, but actually loads of people do.
Well, this is where I know certainly from reading some of Ray's stuff that really bothers him. This excessive stigmatizing of the entire country as inherently untrustworthy, and I'm with him on that. I mean, there's stuff where there's evidence. There's the IP theft in the past. There's currency manipulation. There's bits and bobs. There's evidence, but we've got to be more disciplined and more morally correct and more intellectually honest than to just go anything that comes from China must by definition be dodgy. I mean, that comes back to the Huawei thing. We were chatting about this before. Okay, so the US wants us to totally ban Huawei in our networks, but the chances are there's going to be stuff in our networks that's manufactured in China. It might not have the logo of a Chinese company on it, but if China's so incredibly untrustworthy, then why do we allow anything that's been manufactured in China? Or why do we allow Lenovo servers in the cloud? Yeah. There's so many things, so that they're inconsistent.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we better get to the last one as we're running out of time. So a bit of a change. Vodafone. So they've had their quarterlies this week. I think their quarterlies themselves.
Which is a trading update, really. They don't provide profit numbers in their quarterlies.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really made that distinction.
Trading update.
There I go, being great at my job again. Okay, a trading update. Did you cover it?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Why don't you give us the top line of their trading update? And
seeing
as you're such an expert.
Well, I did cover it, but I went on a specific angle, which is unsurprisingly about Huawei, because that was one of the big announcements that came out.
Well, that was one of the biggest stories.
So it was all in the wake of the UK decision on how much to allow Huawei in the network, and that is a decision that didn't actually affect Vodafone very much. In fact, Nick Reed said it didn't. Basically, it didn't affect them at all in the UK because they use less than 35%. Which is the limit, Huawei equipment in their radio access network.
So they're already good,
and they don't have it at all in the core network, which is Cisco, I think, in Vodafone UK. It's a Cisco core, However, the European Union's also come out with some guidelines. I think it's called a toolbox.
Yeah,
I didn't write about this myself, but they've kind of given the member states a lot of discretion to decide what to do, and sort of made various sort of vague, woolly recommendations like don't use high risk vendors in the core. And as a result of that,
almost copied the UK position.
Yes, it is.
They didn't come up with the 35% thing, but they basically went keep dodgy companies out of the core.
Yeah. So Vodafone's response to that. So Nick Reed on the call basically announced that a year ago they put any investment on Huawei products in the core on pause. They stopped.
Right.
They stopped doing
I think I remember him announcing.
Yeah, it was exactly this time last year.
Until everyone sorted their
and they've
lives
now
out.
decided that they're going to get rid of it all. So all that Huawei stuff in European core networks, and there's obviously several businesses I think that have it. It's going to be removed at a cost of I think 200 million euros. So it's not a massive amount.
No.
I mean, it's not like I think BT was £500 million pounds, wasn't it, to get rid of radio access stuff and maybe some fibre stuff. But yeah, and then he sort of put out this plea on the call that the national regulatory authorities, which have this discretion to kind of decide what to do beyond that they don't start imposing quotas like the UK did. It's obviously something he didn't approve of. And he echoed that line that he came out with again this time last year, that if you do start doing that in the radio access network, it's going to be hundreds of millions potentially. It's going to slow down 5G rollout. It's going to be really disruptive.
2 to 5 years, I think.
2 to 5 years is what he said. Yeah. So that was the sort of main end of my story.
But there you go.
The actual trading update itself was 0.8% organic growth or something. I mean, some markets are getting back on track.
Really I'll tell you what we do care about. We care what John Strand thought about it all, don't we?
Well, he was very pleased, obviously, with the...
I had a little chat with him.
Right, okay. Well,
when
I didn't talk to him. He emailed me a couple of things.
Right, he emailed you.
But yeah,
that's nice. He just rings me up.
He has. Well, he was ringing me last week, and I was busy. I didn't answer him, then I didn't call him back, so he probably thinks I'm
to be fair to him, and if you're
but,
listening, John, this is all said in a friendly way. He doesn't mind. He doesn't take it personally. He don't pick up his call.
No. Well, it's good to have analysts call you.
It's great to chat to him. And I was chatting to him, and what he flagged up to me was... these aren't his precise words, by the way. This is what I sort of took from it. It felt like a bit of a fishing expedition on Vodafone's part. It was like, because it was like our position was the language. Just like you say, it's a trading update. They're saying our position. They're not saying in an accounting way, this is what's going to cost us, and we're putting it in the books.
Yeah.
They're saying our position is that this is the kind of money that we're talking about here. And it felt like a little bit of a fishing expedition to the European Union to go, well, if you're going to put these rules down, then hand over 200 mil. Because why should we foot the bill for your arbitrary sort of things? And then the same goes for that second bit that you were just alluding to with the quotas on the RAN. That again was their way of going, well, if you do, it's going to cost money. Yeah. So you better get your checkbook handy. It happens quite a lot. You get telcos begging for cash off the state quite a lot. Yeah. And I know one of the reasons is that they're heavily regulated. Another reason is that they are part of increasingly critical national infrastructure, so they're strategic national interest and they're being involved. But nonetheless, it just seems unseemly how, more often than not, someone like BT talking about fibre or Vodafone talking about this stuff, they'll just be coming.
Are there signs that BT are doing that in the UK, that they're trying to get somebody to cover those costs? Because they're quite substantial.
Well, I'll tell you another thing that
John,
point that John made, which is relevant, is that BT had also, to some extent, gone, but that £500 million is kind of priced in because we had to upgrade a bunch of old anyway.
Right.
So
that was Strand's early argument a couple of months ago when he wrote that it wouldn't cost the operators so much
because they got to do it anyway.
Huawei.
He's still running with that one.
I can see what he means by that, but I don't go along with it completely. I mean, I think one of the points he's making is this argument that you have to replace 4G equipment because you have to ensure compatibility. He's often said that a lot of that 4G equipment has to be replaced anyway. So a good example is 3, I think, which is moving away from Samsung in the 4G side, and it would probably have to replace that anyway because apparently it's quite old. It's due for upgrade. But I think I'm not sure whether that applies in the case of BT because it really depends on the 4G stuff that they've put in that is Huawei kit that they're now going to have to take out. I mean it's obviously 5G sort of ready or whatever, a lot of it, and they're building the 5G network on top of that. So I don't know if that 500 mil is something they would have had to spend if this ban didn't come along.
Yeah, I think. I mean, John's one of those analysts that's got a fairly healthy scepticism about most things, which is all good. That's what we do as journalists as well. And and he just thinks, what's going on here? Are they making this out to be a bigger, like one-off cost than it actually is? Which is a sort of fair critique, but I'm not qualified to come down hard one way or the other.
But I guess we'll see over the next few quarters, because if they've put the upfront figure out there now, then it's going to have some kind of impact either in terms.
And they said
of
that's over 5 years.
It's over 5 years.
So that's not that much.
Well,
money.
over 5 years is not. Yeah. But it's something they'd rather not be doing, I'm guessing.
Of course.
And I guess the question is how
Still
disruptive
40 mil
is
a
it to
year
the
they'd
5G
rather
rollout?
spend
Maybe
down
that's
the
the bigger
pub.
question. Is it going to be a slower deployment, with worse 5G coverage than we would have had, much worse,
Yeah.
because the the operators have been making a big thing about how the UK is actually at the forefront of 5G, and they've got a good case for it. Pretty much all of them have now got some kind of 5G service, and that's not the case in a lot of European markets where there are all these concerns about EMF and spectrum might not have been awarded or whatever. So is this suddenly going to put the UK kind of down the league tables, into the kind of 5G relegation zone when it was, pushing for, kind of being up there with the US and China?
No, but those are all good questions. One other area in which Vodafone's on the ponce with some justification is in India.
Yeah.
And so he touched on that in the call, and Jamie wrote a follow-up piece about it today as well. He keeps threatening to just pull the plug.
Yeah.
If it's not a direct threat, certainly strongly inferring. So that so they obviously all owe the Indian state about, I'm going to go with zillion again because you know where you stand with it, about 1 zillion rupees.
Yeah.
And he's basically going, look, I've had a look at our assets, I've had a look at our turnover.
It's not worth it.
It's just not worth it. It's just the sums aren't adding up, Modi. Well, so what's going on here? And the Indian state's put itself in an awkward situation because it can't just forego the debt because it considers it legitimate debt from historical license fees and spectrum fees and all that sort of thing. But then again, it's in danger, and the current runaway market leader, which is Jio. Reliance Jio, owes much less because they haven't been around that long. Because this stuff goes back about a decade or something.
Yeah,
and basically they're in a position of almost just creating a monopoly. I don't think Bharti Airtel has threatened to just shut up shop in the way that Vodafone has. But, there's an interesting... And basically he's saying, look, help us out. So you go and find a way politically, whether it's in the form of a rebate or whether it's in the form of dragging this out indefinitely or whatever. Yeah, the Chinese state... the Indian state has still got enough money to keep bailing out those acronym ones. Those MSNBC.
MSNL and BTNL, BSNL and MTNL, whatever.
It can keep bailing them out.
Yeah.
So it's got some cash for Telecoms largesse when it wants to find it. Anyway, so that's that one there. And I think we're running out of time. I want to wrap up with you, Wei. Slightly Vodafone relevant, but you wrote a piece about them in Belgium, was it?
No, the Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. It just came out of the blue because there were plenty of operators who said they would shut down their 3G networks in this decade, in the 20s. But Vodafone just came out and say, well, from the 4th of February, we are taking 3G out of the air in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So it's their JV with Liberty. So it's called Vodafone Ziggo, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the interesting part is 3G is almost a transitional generation because you have the 2G, which will stay here for a long time because it's powering such large volumes of IoT devices out there because low power consumption.
And for roaming as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So 3G is almost getting less and less relevant as when 2G, when I think it was Telstra who was shutting down 2G 2 or 3 years ago in Australia, it became a rather sentimental occasion when people started sort of missing it, but not too many tears will be shed for 3G, I believe.
Like if you're on the train or something, have you noticed on your phone that when you lose 4G, like in the past, it would quite often just go down to H and H+, which is obviously 3G.
Yeah. 2.75, I think that's what they call it.
3.75.
No, 2.75 Edge.
Oh, Edge. I was going to go on to that. But what will typically happen is the cascade of sort of downgrade. It'll say 4G, then it'll say H or H+, and then it'll say E for Edge.
Yeah.
But increasingly, I find I've either got 4G or nothing.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a bit of turning off going on the sly as well.
Don't know. Well, they have to tell you if they're really switching it off. But the point is, if you want to use mobile internet as we do now, we're getting used to it. You can't do that on 3G. The data is just so low.
No, even HSPA plus.
It was never a very good technology when it turned up, and now it's proving even more useless.
It was vastly oversold to
really
everyone. So
the odd numbers don't do very well. The even numbers do. 2G and 4G have been a massive success. 1G and 3G are rubbish.
So 5G is ominous.
I think it's going to be a huge disappointment, this 5G.
Yeah.
Look at the way things are going already.
Yeah, that's certainly one thing I'm going to look to write about at Mobile Congress. Is it any good now that we've actually got it?
Yeah.
But then we've been deeply skeptical.
We said that last
5G.
year, right?
Yeah.
So that's that.
So they just switched off, and I guess that is a bit of an end of an era.
Yeah, I think.
Is it the first one that we're aware of where they've officially announced?
I believe it's the first one, at least in Europe.
They've come out with the targets, though. I can't remember what they are, but they've said that I think pretty much across Europe, I don't know what the date is, but I remember being at
2024 or something like that.
I think it's sooner than that in the UK. I think they're talking about shutting off really soon here. And BT as well has come out with a date for when it's shutting off its 3G network. And it's quite soon. It's not this year, I don't think, but it's not beyond the mid-2020, certainly.
Yeah. So there is so Vodafone released a sort of warning to users if you hold on to your phone for more than, I think, 7 years,
right?
Then that was before 4G was switched on, so you would already be still on 3G.
I can't imagine anybody just has a 3G only phone.
Do you know what I mean?
Some people didn't even get mobile phones until 4G came along anyway.
I think it's either you hold on to the very old feature phone, so you only use it for phone calls, then you can still use it on 2G, or you have a smartphone that will work on 4G.
So actually, there is one more Vodafone angle that we can cover before we wrap it up, which is that the reason to turn off 3G is in part to refarm spectrum. But Vodafone's also been mucking about with this technology called dynamic spectrum sharing, which means that you can share spectrum dynamically, I concluded. This is why I get the big bucks, Ian. And joking aside, it basically allows you to have 4G and 5G signals over the same spectrum at the same time. That's the dynamic bit, which is pretty handy because it means that you don't have to have this switch off one thing and switch on the other thing. You can have both things happening sort of concurrently for a little while. And they did a blog. I think it was the end of last week, but I only became aware of it this week. They did a blog where they'd done some demo, which they reckon was the first time they'd done it. It was with Ericsson and Huawei.
In Düsseldorf, I think.
And then Qualcomm almost inevitably on the modem side. And I guess that's sort of a big deal. Because I think Ray again covered it. Do we think it's a big deal, this dynamic spectrum sharing?
Well, the vendors say it's a big deal. And it's also been talked about in the context of swaps as well, that it makes it easier to. So it came up for me originally, actually, when this whole issue of having to replace your 4G base stations with kit from a different vendor if you have to, if you're forced to change Huawei, because Ericsson and Nokia were both, I think, might have got it wrong, but I think they were both talking about dynamic spectrum sharing as a way of overcoming that problem, that you could sort of run, you could have a single radio that sort of runs these two things at the same time, and it's a way to kind of get around that issue. So, but I guess it's just a move towards having more sort of efficient networks ultimately, isn't it, for the operators? Which is what they want. They want to, keep their costs down and have that flexibility to kind of move spectrum backwards and forwards as and when they need it. And
to me, it seems like a no-brainer if you can do it. And it doesn't degrade the signal of either.
And they're all complaining all the time about spectrum constraints. They can't refarm the 3G spectrum until they've completely shut that down. Obviously, so. Spectrum's a finite resource, so any way that you have of being able to use that in a kind of more efficient way.
As we saw with EE in the UK when they let them refarm ahead of anyone else, their 1800, it gave them a massive head start on 4G, didn't it?
But this with the emergence of all these sort of high-speed video services and God knows what's around the corner, something to do with virtual reality that will put even more pressure on networks. Then
all this utopian 5G stuff.
Then things like dynamic
robotic surgery. That's why we need it.
Didn't Verizon have an advert showing that?
I don't know how the regulators will see it.
That's fireman.
Sorry, I was saying I don't know how the regulators will see it, because nowadays all the operators keep knocking on their doors and, well, we want more spectrum, and
Yeah.
suddenly you can actually
Yeah, they'll say, well,
sort
what
of,
about dynamic spectrum
dynamically sharing
Yeah,
it, and why do you need more
Yeah.
spectrum?
Yeah.
Get a bit of DSS, son.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
DSS, that's right.
Yes, that's brilliant.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I think we've done about an hour. So thanks a lot, guys. I think we got one more before we have to go to Mobile Congress. Is that right?
2 more.
2 more, is it? Okay. Sorry, it just seems so
You're
imminent.
desperate to get there.
Well, it's because I'm
There's
at that stage where
coronavirus out there, mate.
I got PRs get in touch with me to fill up my diary, so it feels incredibly imminent. So anyway, all right. So we don't need to sweat that one. So okay. So thanks a lot for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.